She killed her entire family, but here's why she did it. Imagine a moment so dark, so shocking, that it changes your life forever. A young woman, consumed by anger and pain, takes a step so drastic. She kills her own family. But what if this horrifying act is just the beginning of her journey? Can she ever escape the guilt? Can redemption be found after such a monstrous act? Stay tuned till the end to discover the truth behind her story and the surprising twist that no one saw coming. She stood in the dark kitchen. The silence pressed against her. The only sound, the hum of the refrigerator. Her hands gripped the knife, cold steel, her breath shallow. A bead of sweat slipped down her temple. Her family was just in the next room. Her father, her mother, her little brother. Laughter echoed from the living room. They had no idea. A sudden crash. The glass from a fallen mug shattered. Her heart skipped a beat. Did they hear? She stood still, frozen. The sound of footsteps, light and quick, approached. It was her brother, the youngest, just 10 years old. He stopped at the doorway. His eyes met hers. There was something strange in his gaze, something curious. She didn't move, couldn't. He stepped inside. The door creaked slightly as it closed behind him. "Are you okay?" His voice was soft, unaware. She didn't answer. The knife felt heavier in her hand. She could almost taste the blood. The thought of it had been consuming her for weeks. The silence stretched. Her brother shifted, sensing the tension. "What's going on?" His question hung in the air. She raised the knife, a small, almost imperceptible movement. His eyes widened. He took a step back. He didn't know, but he would. Her breath grew quicker, faster. The panic surged. Her mind raced. She wasn't sure when it happened, but it did. The first scream shattered the quiet. Then another. Her mother, her father. The world around her blurred. Each step felt heavier. The walls seemed to close in. It was too late. No turning back. The deed was done, and she was alone. Alone with the silence. The silence was deafening. Her breath quickened, ragged. She looked around. The blood. It was everywhere. Her hands were shaking, but they still gripped the knife. The handle was slick now, warm. She stumbled back, her shoes slipping on the wet floor. She didn't know where to go. The walls felt too close, too confining. Her mind was a blur. Why did she do it? What had driven her to this? The door to the living room creaked. Her brother. He was still there. She could see his eyes, full of confusion, full of fear. He stepped closer. "What happened?" he stammered. He reached for her. She wanted to scream, to tell him it was all over, but the words wouldn't come. Her fingers tightened around the knife. Her chest tightened with panic. She couldn't let him escape. She couldn't. His hand brushed against her arm. He was too close. She lashed out. The sharp edge cut deep. He gasped, his body crumpling to the floor. The room seemed to spin. His eyes stared up at her, in disbelief, his tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She stepped back, shaking. Her legs gave way. She sank to the floor, her back pressed against the cold wall. Tears welled up, but she didn't let them fall. She couldn't feel anything, not anymore. The house was eerily quiet now. The only sound was her own ragged breathing. She could hear the faint echo of sirens in the distance, but it wouldn't matter, not now. The blood pooled around her, dark and thick. Her world, now stained. Her family, gone. She had killed them all, just for this. And there was no escape from the consequences. The sirens grew louder, closer. Her chest tightened. The reality began to sink in. What had she done? She could hear the screech of tires outside. Voices, faint but growing louder. Her heart pounded in her ears. Each beat felt like it would tear her apart. Her vision blurred. She wanted to run, to hide, but where could she go? There was nowhere left. Footsteps approached the door. Slow, deliberate. Her fingers tightened on the knife once more. But it was useless now. The sound of the door crashing open. The heavy footsteps. They were here. She could hear the sharp intake of breath as the officers entered the room. They froze, their eyes taking in the carnage, the blood, the bodies, her face. For a moment, there was no movement, no words. Then one of them stepped forward, a man tall, his expression unreadable. He spoke softly, but his voice was like ice. Put the knife down. Her fingers twitched, but the knife remained clenched. The weight of it felt like the weight of the entire world. Her eyes met his. She didn't speak, couldn't. The man took another step closer, his hand extended, calm and steady. Put the knife down now. Her mind raced. Would they understand? She shook her head. She couldn't. Suddenly, the room felt too small, too suffocating. Her breath was shallow. She heard another voice, this time from behind her. A woman. Don't do this. Please. But it was too late. She had already made her choice. Her grip loosened. The knife slipped from her hand. But the damage was done. The hours dragged on. The room was silent, except for the occasional shuffle of feet outside. She sat there, staring at her hands, still stained with the dark crimson that once flowed through her family. The smell of iron lingered in her nostrils. It was the only thing she could smell. Her mind replayed the events over and over. The laughter from the living room, the crash of glass, the cold touch of the knife. What had driven her? What had pushed her to this? Her heart twisted. A cold, gnawing emptiness filled her chest. She wanted to feel something, anything, but there was nothing. The door creaked open. A detective entered. He was tall, his face hard, but his eyes were tired. He didn't speak at first, just stood there watching her. She didn't look up. She couldn't. His voice finally broke the silence. Why? The single word hung in the air. It cut through her like a blade. She didn't know how to answer. There was no explanation, no reason that could make sense of what she had done. She took a shaky breath, and for the first time since it all began, tears started to fall. I didn't mean to. The words came out broken, like shattered glass. The detective said nothing. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. She couldn't escape it. Her mind swirled with confusion, regret, fear. What had she done? The question repeated in her head, but she couldn't answer it. There was no answer that would bring her family back. No answer that would change the nightmare she had created. She had thought she was in control, but now she saw the truth. She was lost, trapped in her own madness. The detective sighed. "Tell me everything," he said. And so she did. Her voice was low, shaky. Each word felt like a weight she couldn't carry. The whole truth spilled out. The anger, the resentment, the belief that killing them would give her freedom. She spoke, but it didn't matter. There was no redemption, no way back. And as the words left her lips, she knew she would never be free. The detective listened in silence, his eyes fixed on her as she spoke. Her voice cracked, the weight of her confession crushing her. She didn't even recognize the person who had done it. She had thought she could escape the years of pain, the suffocating grip of a life she hated. But now there was no escape from the consequences. The horror of her actions was all she had left. The room felt colder now. She was no longer in control. The walls seemed to press in on her, suffocating. She stopped speaking, the weight of the confession too much to bear. Her shoulders slumped. Her body felt heavy, numb. She couldn't look at him, couldn't face the judgment in his eyes. Why them? He asked quietly. She didn't answer right away. The question stung. She had no good reason, none that would make sense to anyone else. They didn't understand me, she whispered, her voice small, distant. They didn't see me. Not really. The detective didn't reply. His face was still unreadable, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. For a moment, she felt the sting of regret, but it was fleeting. The guilt was overwhelming, but there was something else, too. A numbness. She didn't want to be a victim, but she had made herself one, and now she was trapped. Tell me everything, he repeated, his voice steady. But she didn't know where to begin anymore. She wanted to scream, wanted to wake up from this nightmare, but it was too late. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Her vision blurred as tears welled up again, but no amount of crying would bring them back. Her family, gone, and she was the one who had taken them away. She had thought it was the only way out, but now there was no way out. The detective's voice broke through the fog in her mind. Your actions, there's no going back. She nodded slowly, the words sinking in. No going back. Not anymore. As they led her out of the room, the reality of it all finally hit. Her body was cold, her soul colder still. She had killed her whole family, and she had done it just for this reason, to escape. But in the end, all she had found was an even darker prison. They escorted her down the long, sterile hallway, each step echoing in the silence. Her feet dragged, her heart too. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting an unsteady glow. The world outside that door felt like a distant memory, a life she no longer recognized. Her hands were still trembling, despite the cold steel cuffs wrapped tightly around her wrists. She glanced at them, her reflection distorted in the glass of the door as they passed. Her mind was numb, empty. But there was one thought that kept pressing, clawing at the back of her mind. Had she really been justified? Was this the only way? The hallway stretched before her, seemingly endless, a never-ending march into darkness. They reached the holding cell, a small, cold room with nothing but a thin mattress on the floor. She was shoved inside without a word. The door clanged shut behind her. She sank to the floor, the rough concrete biting through her thin clothes. The silence in the cell was suffocating. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. She couldn't look away from the wall. And then the memories hit her like a tidal wave. Her mother's warm embrace, her father's stern but loving gaze, the laughter of her brother, so innocent, so unaware. Why had she done it? Why had she destroyed everything? She curled into herself, hugging her knees tightly to her chest. Her body shook with silent sobs, but there was no comfort, no solace. The hours bled together. Time seemed to move in slow motion, but she felt every second of it. She thought about her family, what was left of them now. Would anyone ever forgive her? Could she ever forgive herself? The answer was as cold and empty as the room around her. Her body grew tired, but her mind refused to quiet. Thoughts swirled, tangled in a maze of guilt and regret. She was trapped. In the room, in her own head, and outside, the world continued to move on. But she was frozen in time, forever bound by the weight of her own choices, forever haunted by the memories of the family she had destroyed. The days blurred together, each one the same as the last. The cold concrete of the cell never felt warmer. The silence was always too loud. Her food was brought in at regular intervals, but she hardly touched it. The prison was a quiet hum around her, a hum that seemed to echo inside her skull. She had lost track of time. The days felt like weeks or maybe just minutes. She couldn't tell anymore. Her thoughts continued to spiral. She thought of her family, each of them fading more with every passing moment. Their faces, their voices, the way they had once loved her. But now, she was nothing to them. They were nothing to her. A knock broke her from the haze. She didn't move at first, not sure if it was real. Another knock, and then the door to her cell opened. A guard stepped inside. "You're wanted for questioning," he said. She didn't ask why. She couldn't. They led her through the narrow hallways of the prison, each step heavier than the last. The interrogation room smelled sterile, like bleach and regret. She was seated at a cold metal table. Her hands were still shaking. This time, there were two detectives. They stood across from her, their expressions as hard as stone. But their eyes were different, searching. "Why did you really do it?" one of them asked, leaning in. The question had become familiar by now, but the weight of it hit her harder than before. Her throat tightened. The words stuck. I thought it would make me free," she whispered, her voice barely audible. One of the detectives exchanged a glance with the other. They didn't respond right away. Instead, they waited. She could feel the weight of their gazes, steady, piercing, waiting for her to say more. But there was nothing left to say. The silence grew thick and suffocating. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, her nails digging into the metal. The detective spoke again, this time softer. "Freedom comes at a cost. Do you know that?" She nodded slowly, her heart sinking. The cost was too high. She knew it now. Her freedom had cost her everything. Her family, her soul. She hadn't known how deep the price would be, but now she did. And no matter how much she wished, no matter how much she begged in her mind, there was no turning back. The door to the interrogation room opened again. Her time was up. They didn't speak as they led her back to her cell. Each step felt heavier than the last. And as the door to her cell closed once more, she realized the truth. She wasn't free. She never had been. And now, she never would be. The cold steel door slammed shut behind her, echoing in the small cell. She didn't move at first, just stood there, feeling the weight of the world settle on her shoulders once again. The faint buzz of the lights overhead filled the silence. It was the only sound that accompanied her now. The silence had become unbearable, deafening. Her mind raced, replaying the detective's words over and over. Freedom comes at a cost. She had thought she could escape, but now she understood. Escape wasn't possible. Not for her. Sinking to the cold, hard floor, she pressed her back against the wall. The mattress was thin, barely a cushion, but she didn't even care anymore. It wasn't the physical discomfort that tormented her. It was the emptiness. Her family, her choices, the life she had destroyed, all of it weighed on her. She closed her eyes, but she couldn't escape the images of them. Her mother's face, filled with concern. Her father's stern, yet loving expression. Her brother's innocent smile. What had she hoped for? That killing them would set her free? That in taking their lives, she would finally take control of her own? But instead, she had plunged herself into an even darker prison. A prison of guilt, regret, and loneliness. A prison of her own making. The tears came again silently, streaking down her face. But they brought no relief, no release. The noise outside her cell grew faint. The guards, the other prisoners, everything felt distant. She felt like she was sinking deeper into an endless abyss. She had wanted freedom, but she had been a fool. Her freedom had come with chains, and those chains weren't made of metal. They were made of the lives she had shattered. She lay down, curling into herself, her body a tight knot of tension and fear. But even as she closed her eyes, the weight of her actions never left her. It would never leave her. Not now. Not ever. And in the silence of the dark cell, she realized the truth. She wasn't just locked in a prison of stone. She was locked in a prison of her own soul. The days became indistinguishable, one blurring into the next. Time felt irrelevant now. The clock on the wall was just a cruel reminder that it kept moving, but she didn't. Each day, she sat in the same spot, staring at the gray walls, trying to quiet the voices in her mind. The haunting memory of their faces, her family's faces. She could still hear their voices, faint whispers in the back of her mind. Her mother's soothing tone, her father's disapproving yet protective words, her brother's innocent laugh, forever silenced. The thought of them, alive and happy just hours before, ate away at her. Had she truly thought this was the only way out? There was a knock at her door, breaking the hollow silence. A voice from the other side. It's time. She didn't ask what it was for. She didn't care anymore. The guards took her through the long corridors, their footsteps echoing against the walls. The fluorescent lights flickered as they passed, casting shadows that seemed to follow her. They arrived at a small room, a room she had been in before. Interrogation. This time, though, it wasn't the detectives. It was something else. A man in a suit sat at the table, his expression unreadable. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't even someone she recognized. He stared at her for a long moment before speaking. "I need you to tell me everything." Her heart fluttered, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. She didn't know what else there was to say. He leaned forward. "This is your last chance, you know." Her breath caught. Last chance? He didn't elaborate, but she knew. She had run out of options. The truth had been spilled, but now they wanted the details. The reason. The real reason. But she couldn't give it to them, because she didn't know. Not anymore. She had destroyed them, but she had never understood why she had done it. Was it rage? Fear? A desperate attempt to be seen? But there was no answer that would change anything. No reason that would make it okay. She stared at him, her gaze vacant. "I don't know." The man said nothing. He stood up and walked to the door, pausing just before leaving. "If you ever want redemption," he said quietly, "you'll need to answer that question." Then the door closed behind him, leaving her alone again. She stood there in the quiet, feeling the weight of his words press down on her chest. Redemption? What was that even supposed to mean anymore? The door to her soul had been shut long ago, and there was no key to open it now. All she had left was the broken pieces of her past and the cold walls of her cell. The room felt smaller, tighter, with each passing second. Her mind echoed with the man's words. Asterisk, if you ever want redemption, you'll need to answer that question. Asterisk. But how could she? How could she find redemption when she couldn't even answer why she had done it? Her thoughts spiraled again, relentless. She had killed them. Killed the people she had once loved. And for what? She could no longer remember the anger that had driven her, the rage that had clouded her vision. Now, there was only the hollow emptiness that remained. Days turned into weeks. The guards came and went. Meals were brought to her, though she rarely touched them. Nothing mattered anymore. She couldn't escape the memories. Her brother's terrified eyes, her mother's pleading voice, her father's final, betrayed look. They had all trusted her, and she had destroyed them. But what made it worse, what gnawed at her insides like a poison, was the deep, gnawing truth. She couldn't even remember why she'd thought it would help. The silence of the cell became her only companion. She began to feel the walls closing in tighter with every breath. It was a suffocating, crushing feeling, like she was drowning in a place that had no end. Her mind started to break down. Sleep came in fits and starts, disturbed by nightmares that pulled her into a waking hell. Her dreams were filled with flashes of her family, each one taunting her. Their faces twisted, their voices accusing her, demanding answers she didn't have. One night, she woke up screaming, her hands clutching at the thin mattress beneath her. Her chest was tight, her heart racing. The cold air in the cell didn't help. She felt as though she was being buried alive. The door to her cell creaked open. A guard stepped inside, his eyes tired but steady. He said nothing at first, just stood there watching her. Finally, he spoke. "Can you hear them?" She blinked, confused. "Hear who?" "Your family," he replied softly. "You've been hearing their voices, haven't you?" Her breath caught. Was it true? She nodded slowly, her eyes wide. "Yes," she whispered. "They never stop. They're always with me." The guard looked at her with a quiet understanding, but said nothing more. He simply stepped back, closing the door behind him. She was left alone again. But now there was something different. The weight of the silence was unbearable. Her family's voices weren't just memories anymore. They were with her, lingering in the corners of her mind, never fading. Could she find redemption? Or was she destined to live with this torture forever? The question haunted her, like the shadows that clung to the corners of her cell. She was trapped, in her mind, in her guilt, in her endless need for forgiveness that would never come. The voices of her family were louder now, clearer, piercing through the fog of her thoughts. At first, she thought they were just remnants of her broken mind, hallucinations caused by the isolation. But now, they felt so real, so present. Her mother's voice, her brother's laugh, her father's stern warnings. They whispered in her ear, taunting, accusing, reminding her of the destruction she had caused. "You thought you could escape," her mother's voice would say. "You thought killing us would make you free," her father would add. "Look at what you've done," her brother's voice would whisper softly, the pain in it unbearable. It was maddening. She clutched her head, trying to block them out. But it was impossible. They were everywhere. She pressed her palms against her ears, her body trembling. "Why can't I stop hearing them?" she thought. "Why can't I escape this?" The days blended into one another. She couldn't tell if it was morning or night anymore. All she had was the relentless sound of their voices and the suffocating silence between them. Her cell felt smaller now. It felt like it was closing in on her. She hadn't spoken to anyone in days, maybe weeks. Her sense of time had long since collapsed. One evening, or what she thought might be evening, the door to her cell creaked open again. She barely registered it, too lost in the whirlwind of voices in her head. A figure stepped inside, though she didn't look up at first. Only when the footsteps stopped in front of her did she glance up. It was the man in the suit again, the one who had asked her about redemption. He didn't say anything at first. He just observed her, his gaze calm, like he was waiting for something. The voices were quieter now, almost as if they were waiting too. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low. "Tell me what you hear." She stared at him for a moment. Her mouth felt dry. She hadn't spoken in so long. Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. I hear them. They're here. All of them," she whispered. "They never leave me." He nodded slowly. "Tell me why." She felt her chest tighten at his words. Tell him why. How could she? They're angry, she murmured, barely able to form the thoughts. "They're angry because I killed them. They want me to suffer. They want me to feel what I did." The man studied her for a long time, his eyes searching. She could feel his gaze, but it didn't comfort her. Nothing could comfort her. "You're right," he said quietly, "but they don't want you to suffer. Not really." She frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "They want you to understand. They want you to confront what you've done. Only then can you begin to heal." She shook her head, her body shuddering at the thought. "How can I heal when I can never undo what I've done?" she cried. The man's eyes softened slightly. "Redemption comes when you accept responsibility, when you face the truth and allow yourself to feel it. You don't have to forget, but you must stop running from it." His words were like a key, unlocking something deep inside her. something she had buried for so long. She had been running from the truth, from the pain of what she had done. But running had only made it worse. The voices grew fainter now, no longer just taunting her, but quieting in a way that felt almost peaceful. Could it be possible? Could she truly face what she had done? Could she find some form of peace, even now, even after everything? The man stood and turned toward the door. "I'll be back," he said softly, and as the door closed behind him, she sat in the silence. For the first time in a long while, it wasn't suffocating. Maybe, just maybe, she could begin to face what she had done, and in that process, start to feel the weight of the guilt lift, piece by piece. But it wouldn't be easy. It would never be easy. But she was ready to try. The silence stretched around her, thick and almost tangible. She sat still, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The air felt cooler now, but there was a strange stillness to it, an odd calm that settled over her. The voices of her family had gone quiet, but their presence still lingered in her mind, echoing faintly. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel the weight of their accusations pressing on her chest. Instead, there was an emptiness, a space waiting to be filled with something, anything. The door opened again. She didn't look up immediately, but the figure standing in the doorway was unmistakable. It was him, the man in the suit. He didn't speak at first. He simply stepped into the room, closing the door behind him softly. He watched her, his gaze steady, almost expectant. She met his eyes, her breath shaky. "I'm ready," she whispered, barely hearing the words as they left her mouth. He nodded slowly, taking a seat across from her. For the first time, he didn't seem like someone there to interrogate her. He was just there, present. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice low. She didn't understand at first, but then she felt it, the strange comfort in his words. "You're not alone in facing what you've done, but you have to face it." He leaned forward slightly. "Redemption doesn't come quickly or easily. It takes time. It takes effort." She nodded, her chest tight, but her mind clearer than it had been in days. Maybe he was right. Maybe the only way forward was to confront everything head-on, to face her actions, her pain. No more hiding. "I'm ready," she said again, stronger this time. Her voice didn't shake as much. The walls around her, the suffocating isolation, felt less intimidating now. The man looked at her for a long moment before standing up. "There's still a long road ahead, but you've taken the first step." He paused by the door, glancing over his shoulder. "Remember, facing the truth is the only way to free yourself." And with that, he left. The door clicked softly behind him, leaving her alone in the quiet. But the silence didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like an invitation, a chance to begin again. The voices of her family were still there, but now they weren't so loud. They were no longer a constant barrage. Instead, they were distant. Their once harsh words softened by the realization that perhaps they had never wanted her to suffer. They only wanted her to understand. Her hands, still trembling slightly, rested in her lap. And for the first time in a long while, she felt the smallest glimmer of something. Not peace, no, not yet. But maybe the beginning of it. Maybe redemption was possible. Maybe she could start over. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she believed it was worth trying. The days that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. She spent most of her time alone in her cell, but the stillness felt different now. It wasn't oppressive. It wasn't suffocating. She began to think, to reflect in a way she hadn't allowed herself before. The man's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, facing the truth is the only way to free yourself. Asterisk. It was a strange comfort, and it gave her a purpose, however small. She had to face what she had done. Asterisk, really asterisk, face it. Not just the surface pain, but the reason behind it. The part of her that had broken. Her memories had always been fragmented, blurry around the edges. But now, when she allowed herself to remember, they came in sharper focus. The anger she had felt, the fear, the desperation, all of it had been tangled in a web that had led to that moment. She could see it now. She could see the choices she had made, the way her own brokenness had twisted her mind, convincing her that murder was the only way out. But it wasn't. It never had been. Her fingers curled into a fist as she sat in the cold, dim light of her cell. She couldn't undo what she had done, but she could begin to understand it. And in that understanding, maybe, just maybe, she could start to forgive herself. The voices, once so loud and accusing, had faded further with each passing day. They weren't gone, not completely, but they didn't torment her the way they once had. She had begun to hear them differently, less like accusations, more like reminders. They reminded her of who she had been, of the people she had loved, of the family she had destroyed. The weight of her actions was still there, heavy and painful, but now it was a weight she could bear, because she was no longer running from it. One morning, or what she assumed to be morning, the door to her cell opened again. The guard stepped inside. For a moment, they both just stood there, staring at each other. "You're being moved," the guard said simply. Her heart skipped a beat. "Moved? Where?" "I don't know the details," he continued, his voice neutral. "But it's time." She didn't ask any more questions. She stood up slowly, her legs unsteady at first. As she walked down the hall, the familiar, sterile air of the prison felt almost less oppressive. The light from the narrow windows seemed brighter somehow. They arrived at a new room, one she had never seen before. There were no harsh lights, no cold steel. This room felt different. A man was waiting for her there. Not the man in the suit, but someone else. Someone she didn't recognize. He was sitting at a table, papers in front of him. "Sit down," he said gently. She did, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't know what was coming next, but for the first time, she felt like she could face it. The man glanced at her for a moment before speaking. "Do you want to talk about it?" She felt the question reverberate through her. "Do you want to talk about it?" The thing she had been running from for so long. The thing that had consumed her. Her mind raced. But as she opened her mouth to answer, something surprising happened. She found her voice. "I do," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "I'm ready." The man nodded, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she was being judged. She felt like someone was finally seeing her, truly seeing her. And maybe that was the first step, not toward freedom, but toward healing. It was a long road ahead, but she was no longer afraid to walk it, the weight of her past never fully lifted. It was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. But with each passing day, she learned to carry it differently. She no longer let it crush her. The voices of her family, though still present, had become quieter, more distant. They weren't gone, not entirely, but they no longer held the same power over her. She had learned to live with them, to accept that some things could never be erased. But she didn't have to let them define her anymore. The road ahead was long. Redemption was not a destination. It was a journey, and she was walking it, step by painful step. She began to speak to the counselors, to confront the parts of herself she had long buried. She spoke of her anger, her hurt, her fear. She spoke of the brokenness that had led her to that moment, the moment where she had taken everything from her family. And each time, the burden lifted just a little more. Her nights were still filled with dreams of them. Her mother's soft voice calling her name. Her father's disappointed gaze. Her brother's silent tears. But the dreams had shifted. They were no longer nightmares. Now they were memories, bittersweet and painful, but not torturous. She had begun to accept that she would never be free of her past, but that didn't mean she had to be trapped by it forever. She could live despite it. She could breathe despite it. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, casting a golden light into her small room, she realized something. She was still here. She had made it through. The road to redemption was not clear, and there were still moments where she doubted herself, where the memories clawed at her. But for the first time in years, she felt a small spark of hope. She wasn't free of her guilt, but she was learning to live with it, and that, she realized, was the first true step toward healing. She could never undo what she had done, but maybe, just maybe, she could make peace with it. The days stretched on, each one a quiet step forward. There were no grand moments of clarity, no sudden flashes of redemption. It was slow, almost imperceptible, but it was progress. She had come to terms with the fact that she could never erase the past. The people she had loved, killed, would never return, and the guilt she carried would always be a part of her. But it didn't have to be everything she was. The small moments began to matter more. The soft light through the window, the rare moments of silence that didn't suffocate her, the way her heart didn't race as much when she remembered what she had done. She had learned to forgive herself, not in some grand gesture, but in quiet acceptance. Each day, she made a choice to not let her past completely define her. And though it wasn't easy, it became less daunting as time went on. There were still bad days, still moments when the weight of what she had done threatened to drag her back into the dark. But she learned to breathe through them, to sit with the pain and let it pass, rather than letting it consume her. She had begun to form new habits, new routines. She spent time writing in a journal, pouring her thoughts out in a way that felt freeing. She read books that helped her understand herself better, books that gave her a sense of connection to a world beyond the walls. And sometimes, when the silence became too much, she spoke aloud to no one but herself, reminding herself that she was still trying. No one had told her it would be easy. No one had promised that she would ever fully escape the shadow of her past, but she had come to understand that she didn't need to. What mattered was how she lived from here on out. And so, she moved forward, one breath, one step at a time. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, she felt like she could walk it.